With like a Shirley Jackson or Henry James, you're coming up against their legacy, which is a defined thing at that point. You know, the whole story's kind of been told. When you're dealing with a living author, you're just terrified of pissing them off.
Sometimes an angry tweet is scarier than a ghost.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Yes.
Hey, Spooky Nerds, Aaron Sagers here at New York Comic Con with the creative team behind the Midnight Club. Mike, let me just start with you. Like, what made, out of all of Christopher Pike's work, what made Midnight Club the one that you found to be the most relevant and worthy of adaptation?
Well, like among Pike's library, which is huge,
Yeah.
he's got like 80 books. Midnight Club is different. It's more grounded. It's got a really heavy premise. You know, it's these kids, teenagers who have terminal diagnoses who are in a hospice, and they meet every night at midnight to tell each other stories. And so we are adapting that story, but we're also adapting a ton of other Christopher Pike books because the stories that they tell are other Christopher Pike books. So this gave us a chance not only to adapt The Midnight Club, which is a very special book in its own right and was my favorite of the Pike books growing up, but we got to pull in a whole bunch of other stuff as well. Okay. And so this is really kind of it's a whole celebration of Christopher Pike.
The Russian doll of Christopher Pike.
I like that.
Christopher Pike and Christopher Pike.
That's the headline right there. Okay. Yeah. Tonally, aesthetically, how do you approach this as opposed to Midnight Mass, Bly Manor, Hill House? Very different types of stories, but what's the approach to this one as opposed to those? And actually, I mean, Leah, why don't you speak to that as well?
Well, I worked with these guys on Bly,
Yeah.
And this is my second show in the Intrepid camp. Everything feels like it's in the same world. There's there's a lot of scares, but right in the center of it, there's just a lot of hope and a lot of love. So sorry, Mike, to like really just like spill it out, but I feel like that's always like a theme, and I think we always want to like focus on the real. What these kids are dealing with, and it's a very meta show in that they are, telling these stories to cope, and we're telling these stories to cope. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Trevor, is there a difference in your mind between kind of adult-focused or adult-targeted horror versus teen horror?
Well, yes and no. Yes, in as much as, we did envision this as something that would reach an audience that might be younger than, say, Midnight Mass. No, in as much as we are adopting the ethos that Christopher Pike kind of perfected, that he treats his young protagonists with respect, doesn't pull punches, puts them in real situations, treats them like adults. And to that extent, it's not different at all. There is, I think, compared to some other stuff you've seen from us, a little more sense of fun in this show than in some of the others. So that differs a little. And we're playing in multiple genres, not just horror. So it's, it differs in that sense as well. I
really give you a lot of credit for kind of reteaching audiences to appreciate sort of that gothic horror, creeping dread vibe that we get out of ghost stories. You and I would also say Guillermo del Toro. With this, is this kind of a continuation of that, or are you willing to lean into a little bit more of maybe a little bit more gore, a little bit like, are you going to play around a little bit more in this sandbox?
Yes, the Gothic horror tradition, which is one of my favorites, and which Guillermo del Toro is unmatched, I think, at exploring. We get to play with that a little bit in this show. We're constantly switching aesthetics on the Midnight Club. Kind of every story that's told lets us hit the reset button and do something different. So we have classic film noir, we have 90s James Cameron sci-fi, we have straight kind of Fincher-esque serial killer stories. We're all kind of all over the place. But our next series, The Fall of the House of Usher, when you talk about more gore, more Gothic horror, that show is bonkers and is kind of our first real swing at Giallo. And so it's often a completely different direction and pretty blood-soaked and really fun. And I think doing this show and being able to really kind of stretch into different subgenre, I think gave us a lot of courage to try to take that in that direction. So
I love that answer. I'm very excited. I mean, I was already excited about Usher, but even more so now. Why do you think that Why do you think facing your own mortality, as these characters are, these very young characters are, why is this a good time for them to be telling ghost stories and scary stories? What is it about, facing your own death that makes it a good time to tell scary stories?
The writer's room was kind of like its own little midnight club. Like, it was the beginning of the pandemic and all of us had no clue what the hell was going on. And so we got together every day on Zoom and we told stories to each other. And it really helped all of us feel a little bit better. And yeah, that was a big part of the club.
Well, it's also one thing we discovered making the show was that although not everybody talks about it, everybody has an experience where they've lost someone too young. And it kind of permeated the cast and crew that it was, everybody has that thing to relate to. I lost a cousin extremely young to leukemia, as a matter of fact. But everybody has a story like that, and not everybody talks about it. And the one thing the show, I think, does, and it certainly did for the cast and crew, was it kind of brought that stuff out into the open. And I have to give a lot of credit to Heather Langenkamp in this, but she, said time and time again, don't let that, this isn't a sad show. Like, make it lively, make it fun. Don't forget the levity, because all that's a kind of big part of life too. So regardless of when this moment hits you, and it is tragic, when it hits young people, I think it's kind of a great tone to take.
Mm-hmm. And I think too that regardless of what you think happens in the afterlife or what your religious beliefs are, your spiritual beliefs, one thing that none of us can argue with is that when we're gone, we become stories. That's what we leave behind. And we populate other people's stories and their memories of us. We become stories that are passed down between the people that knew us, sometimes to people that will never know us. And so to celebrate life by, at the brink of kind of confronting mortality the way these characters are, by telling stories. Leah actually came up with a really phenomenal way to describe that made it into the dialogue of the show, which was... You said they get together and they make ghosts. And, that's what the act of storytelling becomes for them. It's how they define their own ghost. Yeah. And it's pretty cool.
Yeah, and I think, when you turn anything into ghosts and witches and vampires and aliens, it's a lot more digestible for all of us. Yeah. So.
I mean, during times of widespread tragedy and trauma, it seems like humanity gravitates more to either a belief in the afterlife or just telling ghost stories overall. And you said that during this time, during the development time, you were on these Zoom calls and you were telling ghost stories. So can you give me an inside peek about some of the stories that each of you were telling one another? What were your stories?
This is something that you do in every writer's room. We make us tell a ghost story.
I know, it always starts, and it can start with, tell us all about a time where you've experienced something you can't explain. Tell us a ghost story that you heard as a child. It can be something from life. It can be something that you've read. It can be something you saw. That idea that we're all sitting around the fire telling stories to each other. All of our writers' rooms do start like that. I think we spent the first 2 weeks telling each other our own stories, and then we spent the immediate time after that telling each other Christopher Pike stories. We divided them up among the writers.
All the books, and then you had to give your book reports. You had to tell it verbally, which is like being in the Midnight Club. It's you gotta bring out that performance.
That's really awesome. I mean, now I'm just like, I need to get a pass into this writer's room to observe the stories, or you need to put it out as a podcast or something.
If there's another way to monetize a writer's room, then we're all about it. We could sell tickets to our insane experiences in the writer's room. That would be great.
So compared to the other projects that you've worked on, it sounds to me like there was something especially poignant about it. Is that the case? I mean, how did this project sort of change you, impact you personally?
Poignant is a great word because, the source material is what it is. We knew we were dealing with very real things. We're dealing with cancer. We're dealing with kind of young people dying. What changed for me and things I wasn't prepared for was how many personal stories from our cast and crew about their own experiences and their own losses were not only going to come to the foreground. People I've worked with for years and had no idea that they'd been through something like this. It wouldn't just come up and be part of the conversation. It changed the show. It altered the scripts. It changed the characterizations. And so I felt that there was a lot a lot of honor to for people who had gone before that was being kind of poured into the show, and the show changed as a result. I've never had that experience with another show.
Yeah, I also became a parent over the course of this show.
That's a big change.
So yeah, I mean, like, you know, gestating on set, you know, while scripting and then creating, it was a lot, and you know, it obviously it affected a lot of things. Just to it made me think about the story in a different way, for sure.
There's an interesting kind of intersection between the kind of younger audience and the way they talk about death, as opposed to maybe our generation did. I won't paint you with that brush. And I think having it out in the open, it just brings out a lot of feelings that maybe the show will help people talk about or realize or relate to, that I don't think, I mean, I know I have a 12-year-old and she talks about it very differently than I did when I was her age. And, you know, Mike and I are both very happy that this is the first show. He has an 11-year-old and I have a 12-year-old. This is the first work of ours that they're going to get to see.
Mm-hmm. You know, when you're adapting works from, you know, whether it's a Poe and Henry James versus a Stephen King and Christopher Pike, you're dealing with creators that are alive and then some that are dead. When you're approaching the development process, what's the good and bad of dealing with the living and or the dead?
I don't know if it's scarier to deal with a living author or their ghost, but it's both are terrifying in their own way. With like a Shirley Jackson or Henry James, you're coming up against their legacy, which is a defined thing at that point. You know, the whole story's kind of been told, and that's a sacred thing. When you're dealing with a living author, you're just terrified of pissing them off because they can do what one of my heroes, Stephen King, famously hated Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining. And that's the kind of stuff that keeps you up at night, is that author is going to look at what you've made and be like, I hate this, and say it for the whole world. You know, and how do you bounce back from that? So they're both
stepped
terrifying.
right into that one.
Stepped right into that trap several times.
I love it. Sometimes an angry tweet is scarier than a ghost.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Yes.
Mike, Trevor, Leah, thank you so much for your time. Again, super excited about it, and also excited to check out Fall of the House of Usher coming soon. So.
Well, we don't know when. Next year sometime, we think.
Soonish.
Soonish.
Not soon enough.
Yeah, not nearly soon enough.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you.